He was the wisest man who ever lived, and yet somehow he became one of the most foolish. How does that even happen? Solomon built a kingdom unlike anything Israel had ever seen. His wealth was staggering, his wisdom legendary. Kings and queens traveled from distant lands just to hear him speak. Under his rule, Israel thrived in peace, prosperity, and the unmistakable favor of God. He wrote some of the Bible's most profound books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. He constructed the breathtaking temple of Yahweh, a place where heaven and earth seemed to meet. But this is not a story that ends in triumph. It ends in heartbreak. Because somewhere along the way, Solomon, the man who had it all, abandoned his own wisdom. He didn't just drift from God, he sprinted toward destruction, building altars to false gods and losing sight of the truth he once cherished. His story is a warning, a mirror, and a question. How can someone so wise become so lost? What mistakes did Solomon make that led to his downfall? And here's the real question. Are we making those same mistakes? Stay with me, because Solomon's story might just be yours. Before Solomon ever wore a crown, his life began in the middle of a national scandal, one of the darkest chapters in Israel's history. His father, King David, was a legend, Israel's greatest warrior, a man after God's own heart. But even heroes fall. At the height of his reign, David made a devastating choice. Instead of leading his army into battle, he stayed home. One evening, from the roof of his palace, he saw a woman bathing. Her name was Bathsheba. He could have looked away. He didn't. He sent for her, slept with her, and she became pregnant. There was one huge problem. Bathsheba was married, and not just to anyone. Her husband Uriah was one of David's most loyal soldiers. David tried to cover it up. He brought Uriah home from the battlefield, hoping he'd sleep with his wife and assume the baby was his. But Uriah refused. He couldn't enjoy home while his fellow warriors were still fighting. So David panicked, and in one of the most shameful acts in his life, he arranged for Uriah to be killed, sending him to the front lines and sealing his fate. After Uriah died, David married Bathsheba. Maybe he thought the scandal would disappear, but God saw it all, and he sent the prophet Nathan with a message that cut through David's soul. You are the man. Because of his sin, David and Bathsheba's first child died. David was crushed. He fasted, wept, and begged God for mercy. But the consequences had already begun. Still, God didn't abandon David. In his mercy, God gave them another child. This one, born not in scandal, but in grace, was Solomon. From the ashes of failure, God brought forth a promise. But Solomon wasn't handed the throne on a silver platter. David had many sons, and the eldest were expected to take the crown. But every one of them had a dark past. Amnon, the firstborn, committed a horrifying crime against his own sister. In revenge, his brother Absalom murdered him. Absalom then tried to steal the throne by force, leading a rebellion that nearly succeeded. He was charismatic and dangerous, but in the end he died violently, caught in a tree, struck down by David's men. Then came Adonijah. He saw that David was old and frail, and he decided to act. Before David even died, Adonijah declared himself king, throwing a grand feast and gathering military leaders and priests to support him. He thought it was his right. He thought the throne was his. But he made one fatal mistake. He didn't invite Solomon, or the prophet Nathan, or Bathsheba, and they acted fast. So the prophet Nathan and Bathsheba went to David. Time was running out. The kingdom was hanging in the balance, and the man who had once slain giants now lay old and weak on his bed. But they reminded him, God had made a promise. Solomon was the one chosen to be king. David didn't hesitate. Even in his final days, the warrior in him rose one last time. He summoned 3 trusted men, Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the warrior. Together they anointed Solomon as king, placing him on David's own throne before he had even died. Meanwhile, just across the city, Adonijah was throwing himself a victory feast. He believed the crown was already his. But then the sound of trumpets shattered the air. Joyous shouts echoed through Jerusalem. Long live King Solomon! In an instant, the party was over. Adonijah froze. His supporters scattered. The bold prince who thought he had won now ran in terror, straight to the altar of God. He clung to its horns, desperate, afraid, and begging for his life. In Israelite tradition, grabbing the altar was a sacred plea for mercy, a last hope for divine protection. Solomon could have ended him right there. He had every reason to. This was treason. But instead, Solomon offered grace. He said, "If you prove yourself worthy, not a single hair on your head will fall. But if evil is found in you, you will die." And with that, the boy once born in scandal stepped fully into his destiny. He was no longer just the son of David. He was the king. But make no mistake, power is never handed over peacefully, and Solomon's enemies were still lurking in the shadows. This chapter of Solomon's life teaches us some powerful truths. First, God's grace is stronger than our worst mistakes. David and Bathsheba's story should have ended in shame. Instead, it became a testimony of mercy and restoration. No matter your past, God is still writing your story. Second, God's calling doesn't follow human logic. Solomon wasn't the oldest. He wasn't the strongest, but he was God's choice. The world may choose leaders based on popularity, status, or strength. God chooses based on purpose. Third, calling always attracts resistance. Solomon didn't walk into the throne room unopposed. He walked through betrayal, conflict, and chaos. Leadership, purpose, it's never without a fight. And finally, mercy must walk hand in hand with wisdom. Solomon spared Adonijah, but he didn't stop watching him. Not all threats are loud. Some whisper, some smile. Mercy is godly, but blind trust can be deadly. Solomon's reign had officially begun, but peace, that would have to wait. The so-called Golden Age of Israel started not with celebration, but with blood. His enemies weren't finished, not yet, and Solomon knew that a crown is never truly secure until the threats are dealt with. The first came from the same place it always had. Adonijah. Though Solomon had spared him, Adonijah's ambition hadn't died. It had just gone quiet. His next move was subtle, even polite. He asked to marry Abishag, the young woman who had cared for King David in his final days. On the surface, it seemed innocent, but Solomon wasn't fooled. In that time, to marry a former king's concubine was to lay claim to the throne. It was a backdoor coup, a quiet rebellion. And Solomon, he didn't wait. He ordered Adonijah's execution immediately. The second chance had been wasted. Next came Joab, David's former general, a warrior, a legend, but also a traitor. Joab had thrown his support behind Adonijah's false coronation. And when Solomon's wrath came, Joab ran to the altar too, hoping that sacred ground would protect him. But Solomon wasn't playing games. He saw through it. Sanctuary could not be a hiding place for rebellion. Justice had to be done. Joab was executed right there, at the altar. The final threat was a man named Shimei, the one who once cursed David publicly during Absalom's rebellion. David had spared him, but Solomon, he knew better. He placed Shimei under house arrest with one clear rule: leave the city and you die. For 3 years, Shimei obeyed. But then, one day he slipped up. He crossed the line, and Solomon never gave second warnings. Shimei made a critical mistake. After 3 years of confinement, he left the city, just for a single night. But Solomon had made his warning clear, and now he kept his word. Shimei was executed. It was swift, final, and symbolic. With his political enemies removed, Adonijah, Joab, and now Shimei, Solomon's throne was secure. The kingdom was his, the crown unchallenged. He had proven something important. Solomon wasn't just wise. He could be ruthless when necessary. He wasn't only the king appointed by God, he was also a master tactician, capable of navigating power struggles and securing his position through calculated force. But this raised a troubling question. Would Solomon always balance his justice with wisdom? Or would his growing hunger for control lead him down a darker path? With the bloodshed behind him, for now, Solomon turned his attention upward. He knew that strength alone wasn't enough to lead a nation. To govern the people of God, he needed more than soldiers and strategies. He needed wisdom. So he traveled to Gibeon, the most prominent high place in Israel at the time, and there he offered 1,000 burnt sacrifices to God. It was an extravagant act of worship, a public declaration of his devotion and dependence on divine guidance. That night, as the final embers of the sacrifices still smoldered in the air, Solomon had a dream. But this was no ordinary dream. God himself appeared to him, and he spoke these words: "Ask for whatever you want, and I will give it to you." 1 Kings 3:5. Imagine that, the creator of the universe offering to grant your deepest desire. Most kings would have asked for power. Others would beg for unmatched riches, long life, or military domination. But Solomon's answer shocked even heaven. He didn't ask for glory. He didn't ask for gold. Instead, he said, "Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong." 1 Kings 3:9. He asked for wisdom. That one request changed everything. It pleased God so much that he didn't just give Solomon wisdom. He gave him everything he didn't ask for: wealth, honor, peace, and influence beyond anything Israel had ever known. And soon Solomon's wisdom would be tested. Two women came before him. They lived in the same house. Both had newborn sons, but one of the babies had died during the night. Now both women claimed the living child as their own. There were no witnesses, no proof, no DNA tests, nothing but emotion and accusation. This was the kind of problem no king could solve easily. It wasn't a matter of law, it was a matter of the heart. The entire court leaned in to hear Solomon's judgment. Then he said something truly shocking: "Bring me a sword." The room fell silent. The guards obeyed. Then the king spoke again: "Cut the living child in two, give half to one woman and half to the other." Gasps filled the room. Had Solomon lost his mind? What kind of judgment was this? But then everything became clear. One of the women collapsed, crying out, "No, my lord, give her the baby, just don't kill him." The other shrugged coldly and said, "If I can't have him, neither of us will. Cut him in half." And with that, Solomon saw the truth. He pointed to the first woman. "Give the baby to her, she is his mother." 1 Kings 3:27. It was a masterstroke, not just of judgment, but of understanding human nature. News of this ruling spread across Israel and far beyond. People realized this was not an ordinary king. This was a man with a divine gift. This story reveals more than just a clever king. It teaches a powerful lesson. True wisdom isn't about intellect, it's about discernment. It's about knowing people, seeing the heart, reading between the lines. Solomon didn't just give a right answer. He revealed deep truth in a way that left everyone in awe. And from that moment forward, his name carried weight. Leaders from distant lands would one day journey to meet him. His reputation echoed far beyond Israel's borders. But even in this moment of glory, an uncomfortable question lingered. Could Solomon stay humble? Would he continue to walk closely with God, the source of his wisdom? Or would power, praise, and prosperity slowly turn his heart? History has shown us that even the greatest leaders can fall. Alexander the Great conquered the known world by the age of 30, only to die suddenly, leaving his empire in chaos. Napoleon, the tactical genius, rose to rule Europe, only to lose it all to pride and miscalculation. And in modern times, we've seen powerful figures rise, then collapse under the weight of their own ambition. Solomon was different. He had wisdom, he had God's favor, he had everything. But would that be enough? So far, Solomon had passed every test. He started his reign with boldness, he secured the kingdom, he sought God, he judged righteously, and now? Now the golden age of Israel had truly begun. Under Solomon's rule, Israel flourished. A once vulnerable nation surrounded by enemies became an economic and military powerhouse. Trade routes opened. Alliances were forged. Gold flowed through the streets of Jerusalem. Solomon wasn't just a king, he was becoming a legend. But behind the splendor, behind the riches, behind the shimmering throne of peace, a quiet storm was brewing, because the greatest threat to Solomon wasn't outside the kingdom, it was inside his own heart. Solomon's vision was nothing short of revolutionary. He didn't just want to rule Israel, he wanted to transform it, from a once landlocked, war-torn kingdom into a global powerhouse. And he knew something many leaders miss. Power isn't just found in swords and armies. True power flows through trade, diplomacy, and influence. Israel sat at a crossroads between Africa, Arabia, and Asia, and Solomon turned that geography into gold. He opened up trade routes that linked the known world. With the help of the skilled Phoenicians, he built a fleet of ships that rivaled the naval empires of Egypt. Those ships set sail to distant lands, returning with cargoes of gold, silver, ivory, apes, spices, and goods so rare that Israel became the envy of the ancient world. Foreign nations didn't just trade with Solomon, they paid tribute just to stay in his good graces. Israel's economy exploded. Wealth flooded into Jerusalem like never before. But Solomon wasn't just a businessman, he was a master diplomat. Where his father David had built peace through battle, Solomon secured it through marriage. Not one, not 10, 700 wives, 300 concubines, and many of them were princesses, royalty from every neighboring kingdom. These weren't just romantic choices, they were calculated alliances. By marrying into the royal families of Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Sidon, and countless others, Solomon created a network of peace. No enemy would dare attack Israel, because doing so meant going to war with dozens of interconnected kingdoms. But the most legendary moment of his diplomatic reign came not through marriage, but through a visit, a queen, a caravan, a journey of over 1,500 miles across the Arabian desert, the Queen of Sheba. She ruled over one of the richest kingdoms on earth, possibly in present-day Ethiopia or Yemen, known for gold, spices, and mystery. She had heard whispers of Solomon's greatness, stories of a king whose wisdom could solve any riddle, whose wealth rivaled the gods. But she didn't believe the hype, so she came to see it for herself. Her caravan arrived in Jerusalem, loaded with gold, jewels, and the finest spices in the world. And when she finally stood before Solomon, she came with questions, hard ones, riddles that had stumped the best minds in her own kingdom. And Solomon? He answered everyone, not with arrogance, but with clarity, confidence, and calm. She saw his palace, its grandeur, its order. She watched how his servants moved, how his kingdom functioned. She listened to his judgments and teachings. And when it was all too much to take in, she said, "What I heard in my land wasn't even half the truth. Now that I've seen it with my own eyes, you are far greater than I was told." 1 Kings 10:6-7. And then something remarkable happened. She blessed the God of Israel. The Queen of Sheba, pagan royalty, stood in the halls of Solomon's palace and recognized the divine hand behind his success. This wasn't just about admiration. This was a moment when the world looked at Israel and saw God. Solomon's empire was now the center of wealth, wisdom, and wonder. And the numbers? They were staggering. Gold poured in from Ophir. Silver flowed from Tarshish. His palace, 13 years in the making, was filled with luxury. His throne was made of ivory, covered in gold, with 12 lions guarding its steps. There was nothing like it in all the earth. But with every treasure, with every alliance, with every victory, a quiet shift began. Success, it turns out, carries its own kind of danger. Solomon's foreign marriages, once a brilliant political strategy, began to chip away at his foundation. His wives brought more than royal blood. They brought their gods, their altars, their traditions. And Solomon, perhaps out of love, perhaps to keep the peace, allowed it. He built temples to foreign gods. He lit incense to idols. He watched as the very kingdom God had given him became a place of spiritual compromise. This was the king who once wrote, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." Proverbs 9:10. Now, he was inviting idol worship into Jerusalem. This is how it happens, not with a fall, but with a drift. Not with defiance, but with slow distraction. Because success can make you forget your source. Comfort can dull your conviction. And when you have everything, it's easy to believe you don't need God anymore. History is filled with the same pattern. Julius Caesar wasn't killed by enemies, but by friends in the Senate halls of Rome. Napoleon, once unstoppable, lost everything because of his own pride and poor judgment. Modern leaders, from CEOs to presidents to cultural icons, have all fallen. not in their struggles, but in their success. Solomon was no different. His wisdom had built an empire. His diplomacy had forged peace. His vision had brought prosperity. But the same mind that created gold-covered thrones was now building altars to gods that were never real. And the cracks in his kingdom had just begun to form. The God who gave Solomon everything, wisdom, wealth, peace, power, also gave him a warning. Solomon had it all. He was respected by kings, feared by enemies, admired by his people, chosen by God. But sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come when you have nothing. It comes when you have everything. Because prosperity breeds complacency, and the blessings that once lifted Solomon up now quietly began to weigh him down. At first, no one could see it. To the outside world, Israel looked stronger than ever. Trade was booming. Alliances were strong. The palace gleamed with gold. But beneath that golden surface, cracks were forming. Solomon was still wise, still ruling, still making decisions. But his heart, the same heart that once cried out for wisdom, the same heart that built the temple of God, was beginning to wander. His marriages, once brilliant political moves, were now distractions. His wealth, once a gift, became an obsession. The throne that was once established in righteousness now stood on shaky ground. And the question hung in the air. Would Solomon see the danger in time, or would he become the very king he was warned not to be? The answer came slowly, not in one dramatic fall, but in a series of small compromises that built up over years. Solomon didn't fall in battle. He wasn't overthrown. There was no coup, no scandal. His downfall came from within, from a heart slowly drifting from God. At first, those foreign marriages seemed harmless. They were strategic, smart, diplomatic. But God had warned his people long ago, "Do not marry with pagan nations, for they will turn your hearts away from me." Solomon knew this, but he ignored it. The wisest man in the world chose to gamble with temptation. And over time, his wives began to bring their gods into the palace. First quietly, then openly. Shrines to strange gods began to appear in Jerusalem, in the same city that held the temple of Yahweh. And then, in one of the most heartbreaking turns in Israel's history, Solomon, the man who built the temple of the living God, began building altars to false gods, altars to Moloch, to Ashtoreth, to Chemosh. These weren't just harmless customs. These were gods who demanded human sacrifice, gods who corrupted entire nations before Israel. It always starts the same way. First tolerance, then acceptance, then participation, then devotion. And one day the wisest king in history bowed before idols made of stone. God in his mercy had been patient, but after years of watching Solomon's heart drift deeper into idolatry, God finally spoke. "Since you have turned your heart from me, I will tear the kingdom from you." 1 Kings 11:11. But even then, God showed grace. He would not destroy Solomon in his lifetime. Instead, the punishment would fall on his son. Solomon would live to see the beginning of the unraveling. The empire he spent his life building would not last. Once Israel had no enemies, Solomon's wisdom and diplomacy had secured peace. But the moment he turned from God, that peace vanished. Enemies began to rise, suddenly from nowhere. The Edomites, once driven out by David, returned. The Arameans attacked from Damascus. A young leader named Jeroboam, chosen by God himself, began preparing to tear the kingdom in two. Everything Solomon had built, the alliances, the wealth, the legacy, it was starting to crumble. The Bible doesn't tell us if Solomon ever repented. There's no grand story of him tearing down the idols, no moment of public confession, no royal decree to return to the Lord. But there is one glimpse, a window into his heart near the end of his life. It comes not in Proverbs, where we see a younger, optimistic king, but in Ecclesiastes, the journal of a man worn down by regret. Solomon, the man who once chased greatness, writes, "I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, it was meaningless, a chasing after the wind." Ecclesiastes 2:10-11. All the gold, all the wives, all the wisdom. Without God, it meant nothing. Solomon's kingdom should have lasted forever. Instead, it was left divided. His son Rehoboam inherited an empire in crisis. The people, crushed under years of heavy taxes and endless building projects, came to the new king and begged, "Lighten our burden, give us relief." But Rehoboam ignored the wisdom of his father. He chose pride over peace, and in doing so triggered a civil war that split Israel in two. Solomon's story is one of brilliance and heartbreak, of a man who started with God, built wonders for his name, but let the world steal his heart. He was the wisest man who ever lived. Yet in the end, wisdom alone could not save him, because wisdom without obedience is just potential without purpose, and greatness without God is just a shadow. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, didn't inherit his father's wisdom, only his throne. And when the moment came to lead, he didn't lean on counsel. He leaned on pride. The elders, those who had stood by Solomon through peace and war, advised him to rule gently, to ease the burdens placed on the people. But Rehoboam ignored them. He surrounded himself with young voices, friends who didn't know the weight of leadership, and he listened to them instead. He told the people, "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier." That one statement broke the kingdom in two. 10 tribes walked away. They followed Jeroboam, a former servant of Solomon who had been anointed by God. Only Judah remained under Rehoboam's rule. The mighty kingdom that Solomon built with wisdom and wealth, the empire that stretched across trade routes and diplomacy, the nation that had once stood united under the blessing of God, was now torn apart by arrogance. The golden age was over. Solomon's story is both inspiring and tragic. Here was a man who had everything: the wisdom of the heavens, the favor of God, the power of a king, the riches of an empire. And yet, he still fell. Why? Because wisdom alone is not enough. You can know what's right and still do what's wrong. Solomon wrote Proverbs, but he didn't live by them. He built the temple, but let foreign gods inside his heart. He had knowledge without obedience, insight without surrender, blessing without gratitude. His life is a warning for leaders, believers, and nations. Success without obedience will lead to failure. Small compromises lead to great downfalls. And no one abandons God in a single moment. It happens slowly, gradually, one choice at a time. And above all, God keeps his promises, in blessing and in judgment. Solomon's reign marked the pinnacle of Israel's history. No king before or after would match his splendor. But more than a king, Solomon was a visionary. His greatest achievement, not his empire, not his palace, but the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. For generations, Israel had worshipped in a tent, a portable tabernacle that moved with them. But now something permanent was about to rise, a house for God. David had longed to build it, but God said, "Your son, whom I will place on the throne in your place, he will build the temple for my name." 1 Kings 5:5. Solomon accepted the call, and he gave it everything. The temple was a masterpiece, built with the finest cedar from Lebanon, carved with images of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, walls, floors, ceilings, overlaid with pure gold. No expense was spared, no detail overlooked. For 7 years, thousands of workers labored, stonecutters, craftsmen, artisans, all working to create a place worthy of God's glory. And when it was finished, Solomon held a dedication ceremony like no other. All of Israel gathered. As the Ark of the Covenant was carried into the Holy of Holies, something happened. Something holy. A thick cloud filled the temple. The glory of the Lord descended. The priests couldn't even stand. In that silence, in that awe, Solomon stood before the people, and he prayed. A prayer of praise, a prayer of repentance, a prayer for future generations. Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you. If your people sin and turn back to you, hear from heaven and forgive. And as if to answer that prayer, fire fell from heaven and consumed the offerings on the altar. The people dropped to their knees in worship. In that moment, it was clear God was with Israel. This was the peak. This was the height of glory. Israel had never been more united, more